Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. But what happens when arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice collide at 30,000 feet? In today's gripping story, a wealthy couple learns the hard way that power doesn't always come in the package they expect. Stay tuned as we take you on a journey of karma, justice, and a twist that no one saw coming. Please subscribe and like this video if you believe that respect is a right. Let's dive in. The aircraft cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight commotion, passengers jostling for overhead bin space, the hum of idle conversations, and the crisp, professional voices of flight attendants directing people to their seats. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the sterile, conditioned air filled the plane as weary travelers settled in for the journey from London Heathrow to Zurich. Then, a slight disruption. An elderly black woman shuffled cautiously down the narrow aisle of the business class section, clutching a small handbag in one hand and gripping the seatbacks for balance with the other. She moved slowly, deliberately, her frail fingers slightly trembling as she adjusted her thick wool coat. Her appearance was neat but modest, her head covered with a burgundy headscarf, her dress a simple brown knit that had seen many years, and her feet clad in well-worn but polished loafers. Her name was Eleanor Okafor, though no one on board knew or cared. She was simply an old woman, traveling alone, out of place in this section of the aircraft. Passengers in business class subtly turned their heads as she passed, some stealing quick glances before looking away, others watching longer, their expressions unreadable. A young flight attendant, noticing her slow pace, stepped forward. "Do you need any help, ma'am?" Before Eleanor could respond, an impatient sigh cut through the space. "Unbelievable," muttered a woman in seat 4B, her crisp British accent laced with irritation. She was in her late 40s, with expensive pearl earrings and a meticulously tailored beige cashmere sweater that looked as though it had never known a stain. Her manicured fingers gripped the armrest tightly. Her husband, seated beside her in 4C, exhaled sharply. He was tall and lean, with slicked-back blonde hair and a Rolex that caught the cabin's overhead lights. He adjusted his tie, his jaw tightening as the elderly woman approached. They were Rupert and Vanessa Sterling, the kind of couple that spoke loudly in restaurants when their steak wasn't cooked precisely to their liking. The kind of people who never had to say they were entitled. It was written in their posture, their expressions, their presence. As Eleanor finally reached their row and glanced down at her boarding pass, her lips moved slightly as if double-checking the number. "Excuse me, I believe I'm in 4A, she said softly, her voice gentle but uncertain. Vanessa's face twisted in disbelief. "What?" She turned to her husband. "Are they just letting anyone into business class now?" Rupert scoffed. "You must be mistaken, madam," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Eleanor blinked, clearly thrown off. She hesitated, then glanced at her boarding pass again, gripping it with slightly unsteady hands. "No, this is my seat, 4A. A few passengers nearby turned their heads at the exchange. Some quickly averted their gaze, pretending not to notice. Others lingered, sensing tension but unwilling to intervene. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, stepped in with a polite but firm smile. "Yes, sir, she's correct. Mrs. Okafor is in 4A. Vanessa let out a scoff, exchanging a look with Rupert. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered under her breath. She moved her legs the bare minimum required, making Eleanor's entrance into her seat as difficult as possible. The old woman struggled, clutching the armrest for support as she eased herself down. Her knees wobbled slightly, and her handbag slipped from her fingers, tumbling onto the floor between them. Rupert made no move to help. Instead, he clicked his tongue in irritation. "This is going to be a long flight," he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. A younger businessman in the row across from them shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between Eleanor and the couple. An older woman 2 rows ahead frowned slightly, but remained silent. The other passengers, most of them well-dressed professionals, chose the easiest path, indifference. Vanessa, still visibly irritated, sighed dramatically and adjusted her sweater. "Well, at least try not to get in our way," she said, barely looking at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded once, her face impassive, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. She had seen this before, many times. She clasped her hands together and gazed out of the window, her fingers tightening over each other. As the last few passengers boarded and the overhead compartments clicked shut, Rupert leaned slightly towards Vanessa and whispered, "I don't know how she got in here, but I doubt she even knows how to use the in-flight entertainment." Vanessa stifled a chuckle. Eleanor remained still. If she had heard them, she didn't react, but others had. And soon they would see what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for weakness. The plane's engines hummed steadily as the final preparations for takeoff were completed. A soft voice crackled through the intercom, announcing the flight duration and reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow over the luxurious business class section. Eleanor Okafor sat still in her seat, her frail hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the small oval window beside her. Outside, the rain had begun to drizzle against the glass, the faint streaks blending into the dull gray of the London sky. Rupert Sterling exhaled sharply beside her, his irritation evident. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his expensive blazer as if merely being in such close proximity to Eleanor was an inconvenience. Vanessa, seated on his other side, was no less subtle. She gave another exaggerated sigh, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck before leaning toward Rupert. "I just don't understand," she muttered, her voice deliberately low but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "This section used to have standards." Rupert smirked. "Well, you know how it is these days. Diversity, isn't it?" He chuckled under his breath. Vanessa scoffed. "Honestly, these airlines need to vet who they allow into business class. I mean, we pay for the comfort, don't we?" Eleanor blinked slowly but said nothing. Her fingers tightened slightly over her lap, yet her expression remained calm, too calm. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged man in a gray suit who had been reading a newspaper lowered it slightly. His sharp eyes flickered toward the couple, his lips pressing into a thin line. Behind them, a woman with short auburn hair, dressed in a navy blue blazer, shifted in her seat, her gaze subtly lingering on the scene. The flight attendant returned, strolling down the aisle with the poise of someone who had dealt with entitled passengers before. She stopped near their row, offering a warm smile. "Would anyone like a drink before takeoff?" Rupert barely glanced at her. "Yes, a scotch. Make it a double," he said impatiently. Vanessa waved a dismissive hand. "I'll have a glass of Sauvignon Blanc." The attendant nodded before turning to Eleanor. "And for you, ma'am?" Before Eleanor could respond, Vanessa let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, darling, she probably just wants water," she said with mock sweetness, tilting her head toward Eleanor as if speaking about a lost pet. Rupert grinned. "Maybe some tea? With extra sugar?" His eyes twinkled with amusement. A soft murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. The woman in the navy blue blazer straightened, her brows knitting together. The man with the newspaper now rested it on his lap, watching silently. Eleanor finally turned her head slightly toward Vanessa and Rupert, studying them for a long moment. Then she lifted her chin, offering a small but knowing smile. "Actually," she said, her voice as smooth as polished mahogany, "I'll have a glass of Merlot." The flight attendant, picking up on the tension, nodded swiftly. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." Rupert let out an amused chuckle, shaking his head. "Merlot? That's ambitious." Vanessa laughed under her breath, but Eleanor had already turned away, looking out the window again. The plane began taxiing, and the cabin grew quieter. The flight attendants made their final checks, securing the overhead bins and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. The rain outside had picked up, droplets racing down the window in jagged patterns. Just as the plane picked up speed for takeoff, Vanessa shifted in her seat and accidentally knocked Eleanor's elbow with a sharp nudge. The impact was just enough to make the old woman jerk slightly, her grip tightening on the armrest. "Oh," Vanessa gasped dramatically. "I do apologize. These seats are just so cramped, aren't they?" Rupert chuckled under his breath. Eleanor took a slow breath, her lips pressing together. She didn't look at Vanessa, didn't acknowledge the childish provocation. But something in her posture changed ever so slightly, and across the aisle, the woman in the navy blue blazer leaned forward just a fraction, watching closely. As the plane lifted into the air, the tension in row 4 was no longer subtle. It was thick, like a storm waiting to break. And Eleanor Okafor, despite her frail appearance, was no stranger to storms. The plane had leveled at cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The tension in row 4 was palpable, like an unspoken challenge lingering in the air. The flight attendants had begun serving drinks, moving gracefully between the aisles with practiced ease. Eleanor Okafor sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes still fixed on the world beyond the window. Rupert and Vanessa Sterling, however, had not lost their smugness. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine, swirling it in her glass with an air of superiority. She turned slightly toward Eleanor, eyeing her as one might observe an insect on the window pane. "I suppose you're visiting family in Zurich?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet, her intent anything but kind. Eleanor turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Business," she said simply. Rupert let out a quiet scoff. "Business? That's interesting. And what kind of business would that be?" There was something sharp beneath his tone, a subtle but unmistakable assumption that whatever she did, it could not possibly be important. Eleanor finally moved. She turned fully toward them, her warm brown eyes locking onto Rupert's with a quiet force that made him shift ever so slightly in his seat. "The kind that ensures people like you don't get away with behavior like this," she said, her voice calm but firm. Rupert's smirk faltered for the first time. "Excuse me?" Eleanor reached into her handbag, pulled out a sleek, leather-bound case, and carefully removed a business card. She held it between her fingers for a moment before placing it gently on the armrest between them. Vanessa, curiosity overriding her arrogance, snatched it up. Her eyes scanned the text, and then her face drained of color. Rupert leaned in to read it, and his expression darkened instantly. Eleanor Okafor, Attorney General, International Human Rights Division. Silence. The kind that swallows the air, that suffocates arrogance and leaves only the weight of realization behind. The businessman across the aisle, who had been silently observing, raised an eyebrow. The woman in the navy blue blazer, who had been waiting for this moment, let out an amused breath and leaned back into her seat. A few nearby passengers, who had overheard the conversation, exchanged knowing glances. Eleanor took her time before speaking again. She reached for her glass of Merlot, took a delicate sip, then placed it back down with quiet precision. "I specialize in cases of racial and social discrimination. In fact, I just left a conference in London where we discussed the rise of microaggressions and systemic bias in professional spaces. Fascinating, isn't it?" Rupert's mouth opened, but no words came out. Vanessa, still gripping the card, looked as if she had swallowed something bitter. I didn't mean anything by..." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, offering a small smile. "Didn't you?" A tense beat passed, then another. Rupert straightened in his seat, clearing his throat. "Look, there's no need to be dramatic," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "We were just making conversation." Eleanor exhaled softly, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice still measured. "You weren't." She leaned in slightly, just enough to make them both uncomfortable. "You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed that because I am old and because I am black, I must be lost or out of place. You mocked me, dismissed me, and you thought no one would care because people like me are used to it, aren't we?" Rupert shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa, still stunned, opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. Eleanor glanced around at the nearby passengers, the ones who had watched but stayed silent, the ones who had pretended not to notice, the ones who had looked away. "Respect," she said finally, her voice carrying just enough weight to fill the space. "It doesn't cost anything, and yet some of you seem unwilling to offer it." A few seats down, the businessman set his newspaper aside and gave a slow, approving nod. The woman in the navy blue blazer smiled slightly. Someone a few rows back let out a quiet hum of agreement. Rupert clenched his jaw. Vanessa looked utterly humiliated, but neither of them spoke. Eleanor turned back toward her window, settling back into her seat, her expression peaceful. "Enjoy your flight," she said softly, picking up her glass of Merlot once more. And for the first time since takeoff, Rupert and Vanessa Sterling had nothing to say. The tension in row 4 had thickened into something almost suffocating. Eleanor Okafor had returned to her quiet dignity, sipping her Merlot as if the confrontation had never happened. But for Rupert and Vanessa Sterling, the weight of their own words and actions now pressed down on them like an unbearable heat. Rupert shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest, his jaw clenched, and the tips of his ears burned red. Vanessa, usually so quick to have the last word, sat stiffly beside him, her manicured nails gripping the business card as though it might crumble under her grasp. Across the aisle, the businessman in the gray suit folded his newspaper and set it aside. He studied Rupert and Vanessa for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "Quite the embarrassment, isn't it?" Rupert's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" The man shrugged, adjusting his cufflinks. "I mean, here you are, so confident a moment ago, speaking loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. And now, suddenly you have nothing to say." Vanessa stiffened. "We were just making conversation. People are so sensitive these days." "You weren't making conversation," the woman in the navy blue blazer cut in, her voice cool. "You were degrading someone you assumed had no power. But now that you know exactly who she is, you're suddenly uncomfortable." Several passengers had begun to pay attention now, some pretending not to listen while others openly watched. A younger man across the aisle, a student judging by the textbooks on his tray, leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Rupert let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. We're not racist," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "This whole thing is being blown out of proportion." Eleanor turned her gaze back to him, her expression unreadable. "If you truly believe that, why do you look so guilty?" Silence. Vanessa inhaled sharply. "Look, we didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You didn't mean for everyone to hear? You didn't mean to be caught?" Rupert's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked around the cabin as if hoping someone, anyone, would come to his defense. But the other passengers who had heard everything now seemed unwilling to meet his gaze. Not because they disagreed, because they didn't want to get involved. And that was the real problem. The older woman in the row ahead, who had glanced back more than once, suddenly busied herself with her in-flight magazine. The young man across the aisle hesitated, then looked down at his phone. Even the businessman, who had spoken up moments ago, didn't push further. No one wanted to be the one to challenge Rupert and Vanessa directly. No one wanted to risk an argument. And so, as always, silence allowed their type to thrive. Eleanor let out a slow breath. "This is why it continues," she murmured almost to herself. "Because when the moment comes to stand for something, most people sit quietly instead." A flicker of shame crossed the young student's face, but he said nothing. Vanessa exhaled sharply, tossing the business card onto the tray table as though it had burned her. "Whatever," she muttered, crossing her arms. Rupert, still glaring, reached for his scotch and downed it in one aggressive gulp, but his hands were trembling slightly. The flight attendant returned just then, setting Eleanor's meal before her with a polite smile. She glanced at Rupert and Vanessa, her lips twitching in something that wasn't quite a smirk, but close. "Everything all right here?" Eleanor picked up her fork with deliberate ease. "Perfectly fine," she said, taking her first bite. Rupert and Vanessa said nothing, because for the first time, they were the ones feeling small. And Eleanor Okafor? She had seen this play out too many times before. She would finish her meal. She would enjoy her flight. And when the plane landed, she would go right back to doing what she did best, ensuring that people like them could no longer hide behind silence. As the plane began its descent into Zurich, the tension in row 4 had settled into a cold, uneasy quiet. Eleanor Okafor remained composed, finishing her meal with the same measured grace she had displayed throughout the flight. Rupert and Vanessa Sterling, on the other hand, sat stiffly, the weight of their humiliation pressing down on them like an anchor. The businessman had returned to his newspaper. The woman in the navy blue blazer scrolled idly through her phone. The young student across the aisle glanced occasionally at Eleanor, as if debating whether to say something, but in the end he remained silent. A slight jolt signaled the landing gear deploying. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Zurich Airport. The city's skyline came into view, a picture of European precision and modernity. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, the twist came. The flight attendants had just begun their final checks when a man in a dark suit moved swiftly down the aisle, pausing at row 4. He was tall, efficient-looking, and wore a badge clipped to his blazer. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Rupert and Vanessa. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, his voice cool and professional. Rupert stiffened. Yes? The man nodded. I'm Agent Muller with the Swiss Border Police. We need to have a word with you once we land. Please remain seated until an officer escorts you off the plane. A ripple of surprise moved through the nearby passengers. Rupert's face drained of color. Vanessa let out a nervous laugh. I think you have the wrong people. Agent Miller didn't blink. I don't believe we do. Rupert turned to Eleanor, his eyes suddenly wild with suspicion. Did you? Eleanor didn't so much as look at him. She reached for her handbag, adjusting the strap with quiet precision. Oh, don't flatter yourself, she murmured, her tone dry. I have far more important things to do than waste my energy on you. Vanessa's hands clenched into fists. Then what is this about? She demanded. The agent merely gestured toward the front of the plane. We'll discuss it once we land. As the plane touched down, passengers whispered amongst themselves, curious but unwilling to get involved. The woman in the navy blue blazer smirked. The businessman glanced at Eleanor with quiet amusement. Even the young student looked mildly impressed. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained utterly serene. As the plane taxied to the gate, Rupert tried again. Look, I don't know what this is about, but we're British citizens. We haven't done anything wrong. Agent Miller raised an unimpressed brow. Then I'm sure you have nothing to worry about. The seatbelt sign blinked off. A flight attendant moved forward, opening the cabin door. Passengers began gathering their belongings, but all eyes were subtly watching row 4. Then, just as Eleanor rose from her seat, Rupert made one last desperate move. This is ridiculous, he barked, standing abruptly. I want to speak to someone in charge. Eleanor turned to him fully for the first time since their confrontation. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her diamond wedding band catching the cabin lights. You're already speaking to someone in charge, she said smoothly. Rupert froze. Then Eleanor turned to Agent Muller, offering a small, polite nod. I assume this is about the tax fraud case? Vanessa sucked in a sharp breath. The agent nodded. Indeed, Madam Attorney General. Rupert staggered slightly. Tax? What? That's absurd. Eleanor gave him a long, measured look. Is it? The realization hit like a brick. The murmurs around them grew louder. Rupert turned red with anger, but there was nowhere to go. Vanessa clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Eleanor slung her handbag over her shoulder and stepped into the aisle. Enjoy your stay in Zurich, she said coolly before walking past them without a second glance. The businessman chuckled softly. The navy blue blazer woman let out a satisfied sigh. And the young student? He finally spoke. Damn. As Eleanor exited the aircraft, the whispers of justice followed her. Behind her, Rupert and Vanessa Sterling remained frozen in place, their downfall unfolding before an audience that had for once refused to stay silent. Because in the end, karma always lands exactly where it's supposed to. What do you think? Was justice served? Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence allowed injustice to thrive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss powerful stories like this. Let's stand together for respect, dignity, and the truth.